Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Mariko in Singapore. The headlines. Drastic action from the US Federal Reserve to tackle coronavirus. It cuts interest rates to near zero and announced a coordinated action with other central banks. As the death toll jumps in France, Italy and Spain, we have a report from Madrid on the huge pressures on hospitals and medical workers.
You go home and you cannot kiss your child and your husband or get too close. You cannot talk to your friends.
And I'm Kasia, Madera in London. Also coming up here on Newsday, South Korea reports fewer than 100 new coronavirus cases for the first time in 3 weeks. We look at how it's managed to slow the spread. And we'll talk to a doctor about all the sensible things that you can do to avoid getting infected.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Good morning. It's 9 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London, and 9 p.m. in Washington, D.C., where the US Central Bank has cut interest rates to almost zero in a bid to protect the economy from the impact of coronavirus. It's the Federal Reserve's second emergency cut in a fortnight, and it took the action in coordination with central banks in Canada, Europe, Britain, Switzerland, and Japan. Here's President Trump's response.
The Federal Reserve is going to be purchasing $500 billion of treasuries and $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities, and that number can increase. But they're going to start with that, and that's really good news. It's really great for our country. It's something that we're very happy. I have to say this. I'm very happy.
Well, earlier I asked our North America correspondent David Willis whether the rate cut was a sign that the US Central Bank is increasingly worried about the impact of the virus on the economy.
Very much so. An indication, it's fair to say, of the concern. The Federal Reserve not waiting until its sixth weekly meeting on Wednesday, but as you say, quite rightly, cutting rates on a Sunday evening. When was the last time that happened? Not even, I think, during the 2008 financial crisis has that happened. But this is a very deep cut in interest rates, bringing them down to virtually zero. And it's a move that the Fed hopes will help stimulate the economy at a time when it is receiving a lot of pressure from the coronavirus. What this basically will do is it will make borrowing money cheaper. And that is intended to certainly help businesses who will continue to have considerable overheads, despite the fact they might not have much in the way of customers. And it will help consumers, so the theory goes, by lessening the amount of interest they have to pay on credit cards. Whether it will actually prompt those people who are perhaps, say, renting their homes at the moment to take the decision to go out and buy is another matter, because there's a feeling here certainly that people have other things on their mind right now.
But the Fed has been under a lot of pressure from President Trump. It was only over the weekend where President Trump said that he could demote Jerome Powell. I mean, one could argue that the Fed has actually bowed to political pressure when it's supposed to be independent.
Well, you're absolutely right. President Trump has made his feelings about the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell fairly well known, and he's been a fierce critic of Mr. Powell, particularly in recent months. He believes that the Fed hasn't acted quickly enough to cut interest rates, to bring them down to the levels perhaps in Europe and Japan. Now, the Federal Reserve believes that negative interest rates are a sign of economic difficulty, so it's been shying away from doing that. But clearly, the Federal Reserve, its chairman, Jerome Powell, now believe that this is a very serious crisis and that something is needed to basically pacify the markets, which have been very volatile, of course, in recent weeks because of the coronavirus.
Well, that was David Willis speaking to me a little earlier. Our business correspondent Katie Austin has also been following the market reaction, and she told me investors don't seem too pleased by the Fed's move.
It certainly looks like the move hasn't shored up the financial markets immediately as Donald Trump might have hoped. And we are seeing US stock market futures down, which is not the desired effect at all. And this is not a very good sign, really. In terms of the significance of the pandemic and actually how effective any measures are to combat it. When we're looking at such a dramatic move, the Fed's second rate cut in a matter of 2 weeks, that almost seems like a sticking plaster at the moment. Such is the global size of the problem we are going to see here in terms of the economic impact, with some people already predicting a global recession. But the US is, in the words of one analyst, throwing the kitchen sink at this. It's launched this huge financial stimulus today, and there have been a bit of criticism of a lack of coordinated action by central banks across the world after these huge market falls we saw over the past week. So there will be some welcoming of the fact that now central banks such as, Canada, the US, the Bank of England and Japan and others have come together and tried to launch coordinated action. The question is, will this really work? Such are the problems in terms of both demand and supply we're seeing across the world. A lot of central banks and governments almost look like they are running out of options here.
Indeed, because I heard Jerome Powell just speaking just a moment ago, ruling out negative interest rates, which means that it leaves the Federal Reserve a very few other options later in the future.
Exactly, and we are, of course, here in the UK, where I am, yet to see the peak of the pandemic in this country, even though around the world we have China now getting back to something resembling normal. So yes, you have to wonder where else there is to go after such a dramatic move. Even though Donald Trump has been pressing the Fed, of course, to act sooner, you do wonder where else they can go from here.
Katie Austin there speaking to Mariko. Of course, we're monitoring lots of reaction on that development. Now, just days after becoming the new epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, Europe has been altered beyond recognition. The streets of Rome, Madrid and Paris are deserted. Borders have been partially shut and tens of millions of people have been ordered to stay at home. Well, Spain is in a state of emergency with the whole population in near total lockdown. From the capital, Madrid, Damien Grammaticus reports, and I just need to warn you that you may find some images from the very beginning of his report distressing.
She's gasping, grief-stricken and infected with the virus. Last night in this hospital, her husband died. Today, doctors have told her to go home. There aren't enough beds to treat her. She's not sick enough. Not yet. Around her, trying to calm her, are her children, now at extreme risk too. They warn us to wear masks, keep a distance. Spain is in the grip of the virus. Everywhere, it's close at hand. Milagros tells me the medics working double shifts are overwhelmed and fearful of being infected themselves.
It's so hard. You go home and you cannot get close to your child or your husband, but it's what we have to do.
No vengáis a urgencia.
And this is that frustration boiling over. Don't come to the hospital if your symptoms are mild, the doctor says. People have to stop flooding emergency rooms. And so Spain has ordered everyone off the streets. Madrid, a major European capital, silent. The police tell anyone they see to go home. Unseen, the virus is propagating, and also the anxiety.
So this is what happens when a country really starts to fear the threat posed by the virus. This is part of Madrid's financial district. And take a look down here, one of the biggest avenues through the city. Just 2 days ago, this was thronged. Now, almost empty.
You're only allowed out to buy food or go to work. Petrol stations are one of the few places that are open, and people have to keep a distance. But Spain was slower to do this than Italy.
They should have put the measures before, because we're neighbors. It was impossible not to. It was going to spread to here. So.
And last night this happened. Applause all across Spain to thank the country's doctors. They came out of their clinics for just a few minutes to acknowledge the gesture, then got back to work, trying to save hundreds more from succumbing to the virus. David Grammaticus, BBC News, Madrid.
Well, elsewhere in Europe, Germany is the latest country to announce new restrictions. There'll be checks at its borders with Austria, France, Switzerland, Denmark and also Luxembourg. Our correspondent Jenny Hill has the latest from Berlin.
We've just had the latest official figures released here. They show that nearly 5,000 people have now tested positive for the virus and 12 people have died. You heard a little bit there about the controls on some of the German border. There are some exemptions, but by and large, unless you've got a good reason for travelling in and out of the country, you won't be able to as of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The exemptions, of course, include people bringing goods in and out of the country, people who can prove that they're commuting for work purposes. But as you heard the Interior Minister saying, there is a sense too from the government that they know that the real crisis has yet to come, and I think we're starting to see more and more measures being put into place as a result.
Italy has reported 368 more coronavirus deaths. It's a new one-day record. Lombardy, the country's worst affected region, accounted for 252 of those. Nationwide, the death toll is more than 1,800. Ireland has called for all bars and pubs in the country to close immediately and remain shut for the next 2 weeks. Earlier, the country's health minister expressed outrage at some people in his country who were out drinking on Saturday evening in Dublin. He said it was an insult to the efforts of doctors and nurses working on this pandemic. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has declared a national state of disaster there following the coronavirus outbreak. He said that citizens from high-risk countries would be denied entry and that screening would be strengthened at all major airports. And the Czech Republic has closed all its borders and also introduced severe restrictions banning people from moving around except for things like work, essential shopping and other necessary activities. That ban on until March the 24th. Schools have also been closed.
Well, over in France, polling stations have closed in the first round of local elections, a poll that went ahead despite lockdown measures to restrict public contact and to contain the spread of coronavirus. But while France was voting, it was also announcing new coronavirus measures, including a reinforcement of the border with Germany. So far, nearly 5,500 cases have been confirmed in France and 127 people have died. Lucy Williamson reports from Paris.
Bars, restaurants and schools are shuttered across the country. Museums and cinemas are locked. The only places still open are essential services, grocers, chemists, newsagents and polling stations. The decision to continue with the first round of this election in the midst of the coronavirus epidemic was reportedly questioned until the last minute. Metal railings were installed in polling stations to channel voters along specific routes. Tape markings on the floor kept them a metre apart from each other. Gloves and hand sanitizer were provided, and voters were asked to bring their own pens. But there's a feeling among some people here that the government is sending mixed messages. Turnout by late afternoon was sharply down, and some doctors have been advising people not to go and vote for fear of catching or spreading the virus. In a week's time, the government faces the same decision again. The second round of this vote is due next Sunday. But what was seen by President Macron's party as a chance to establish itself across the country is now viewed by many here as a chance for coronavirus to do the same. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
Well, from Barcelona to Berlin, millions of people have been told to stay at home unless it's absolutely necessary to go out. So for those of us who do have to leave, how can we get safely from A to B? I asked Dr. Richard Darwood, a travel medicine specialist.
Well, I think it's reassuring to know that most operators of transport systems have really upped their game in terms of hygiene and cleaning, deep cleaning. The airlines have announced this. Public health systems, certainly in London and elsewhere, have announced that they're upping their game. I think we are all becoming increasingly aware of the need to clean our hands after handling frequently touched and handled surfaces, handrails, escalator rails, lift buttons, things like that. There's no harm in touching all of these surfaces as long as one remembers where one's hands have been and uses a hand sanitizer or washes one's hands afterwards before touching anything else. Certainly, I have very few concerns about. A lot of people worry about the air in the aircraft cabin, for example, that is well filtered, and there's not been a single case of coronavirus attributed to taking an international flight, for example.
And when it comes to self-isolation, if someone is concerned about any symptoms that they're possibly showing, when should that come into action?
Well, so the focus is moving away from isolating people who've recently travelled towards encouraging people who have any symptoms whatsoever to stay at home and to avoid travelling or exposing anybody else to risk until their symptoms have gone away. So the focus is not so much on where you've been and where you've come from now as to whether or not you've got any symptoms.
And this idea of the borders closing down, we're seeing so many different countries shutting down their borders, a lot of concern. Is this effective in your opinion?
Well, there's been some very good mathematical modelling in the past on whether or not travel restrictions actually stop the spread of disease. And unfortunately, it's not, although it's a very visible measure and gives people a lot of a sense that something is being done, it doesn't really have a big impact on stopping the spread of disease. And this is particularly going to become even more the case as the rates of infection become uniform across borders. So it's much more important to focus on the way people move around and what they do within a country rather than whether they're coming in or not from abroad. That horse has already bolted. There are so many foci of infection now in many countries where coronavirus is now established that simply pulling up the drawbridge is not going to change very much, I'm afraid.
That was Dr. Richard Darwood speaking to Kasia a little earlier. You're watching Newsday on the BBC, still to come on the programme. Easier said than done. We'll bring you some top tips to help keep your hands away from your face.
Today we have closed the book on apartheid and that chapter.
More than 3,000 subway passengers were affected. Nausea, bleeding, headaches and a dimming of vision. All of this caused by an apparently organised attack.
The trophy itself is on the pedestal in the middle of the cabinet here. Now, this was an international trophy, and we understand now that the search for it has become an international search.
Above all, this was a triumph for the Christian Democrats of the West, offering reunification as quickly as possible, and that's what the voters wanted.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Mariko in Singapore.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm Kasia Madera in London. Our main stories this hour. Drastic action from the Federal Reserve to tackle coronavirus. It is cutting interest rates to 0.25% and has announced coordinated action with other central banks.
As the death toll across Europe rises, Spain begins a state of near lockdown with people only allowed out of their homes to work, buy food or get medical care. Let's now take a look at some front pages from around the world, and the Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper has the latest on Germany's new restrictions that we mentioned earlier. There'll be checks at borders with Austria, France, Switzerland, Denmark and Luxembourg. The paper also includes an editorial describing it as the time of contradictions, solidarity without social contacts, closed societies who want to stay free. The Philippine Star is reporting shopping center closures and a shortage of thermal scanners, and its front page has this picture of a Catholic mass where people are kept apart using caution tape. And the Financial Times is reporting that the UK is looking to step up its response to the threat of the virus. It has this opinion piece saying the coronavirus should be a spur to action to galvanize policymakers, regulators and companies to work together. Kasia.
Mariko, as always, many thanks for that. Coronavirus dominating the news, also dominating the news in the US, where officials say that they are working to improve waiting times for health screening after chaotic scenes for returning travellers at some American airports. The Trump administration's decision to include the UK and also Ireland in its European travel ban comes into effect on Tuesday. Our Washington correspondent Jane O'Brien reports.
As the last link to Europe closed, panicked Americans rushed to beat the travel ban. Immigration at Chicago's O'Hare Airport was overwhelmed, with passengers reporting enormous crowds and unsanitary conditions.
Here at Washington's Dulles Airport, though, it seems the shutdown is already taking hold because it really is eerily quiet here. This is normally one of the nation's busiest international hubs, but looking at the arrivals board, there is already only a handful of planes coming in from Europe.
Americans returning on a plane from London were grateful to be home.
Just given the timing, I think we honestly just lucked out, just given that we got back today instead of tomorrow, because that would have been a lot more hectic.
The airline industry is reeling from the travel bans and cancellations as fewer Americans risk travelling even within the country. American Airlines, the world's second largest carrier, is cutting capacity and suspending almost all long-haul international flights from Monday. The Trump administration is promising sweeping measures to help prop up the economy as America grinds to a halt.
What I'd focus on is, one, what do we need to do right now? Because it's clear we need to get economic relief to the economy.
A shortage of testing kits continues to hamper efforts to get an accurate picture of how far the coronavirus has spread. In Denver, Colorado, people queued for hours at one of the drive-through sites that are starting to open up. But at least one person has been cleared. President Trump, who faced public pressure after coming into contact with an infected person, has now tested negative. But across the country, cases are rising, and so is the death toll. Jane O'Brien, BBC News, Washington.
Now, for the first time in 3 weeks, South Korea has reported fewer than 100 new coronavirus cases. The country has the highest number of cases in Asia after China, with over 8,000 confirmed infections and 75 deaths. But South Korea seems to be enjoying a downward trend in new cases. Here's the country's foreign minister explaining how.
The basic principle is openness, transparency, and fully keeping the public informed. And I think this is paying off. Testing is central because that leads to early detection. It minimizes further spread, and it quickly treats those found with the virus. And I think that's the key behind our very low fatality rate as well.
South Korea's foreign minister there. Now, we've been hearing for quite some time that the best thing to prevent the spread of coronavirus is simply to wash our hands. But it is also important not to touch our faces, something that we almost do involuntarily. Psychologist Natasha Tiwari has some tips to help us stop.
Don't touch your face.
Contagious. And I haven't touched my face in weeks.
Because we can't help it. It's part of our DNA. We're hardwired to do it. We know this because humans as young as fetuses in utero touch their faces. So every time you tell yourself, stop touching your face, don't touch your face, if I touch my face, I'm going to get really ill. You're telling yourself to do something that is entirely unnatural to you. When we touch our faces, what we're really doing is calming ourselves down. When we touch certain areas of our faces, what we're really doing is we're activating certain pressure points, which then activates something called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the thing that makes us calm ourselves down internally. We see the same response in dogs and cats. Children often model the same behavior as their parents. So if our parents, when they're shocked, they touch their faces, or when they're surprised, they touch their faces, or if they're upset, they touch their faces, we're much more likely to do exactly the same thing. The irony is, at a time when it's more important than ever to not touch your face, unconsciously, your mind is constantly moving to a place where it can better protect you. By doing the things that it knows will soothe you, and so your unconscious mind will prompt your hands to go straight to your face. Whilst it's almost impossible to totally stop touching your face, a key way that you can go about making it easier would be to take out the habits which lead you to do it. So that might mean wearing glasses instead of contact lenses. It might mean wearing less makeup so you don't have to top it up throughout the day. It might also mean creating habits around how you use your hands. So rather than perhaps when you're always moving around and having your hands like this and making it so easy for them to land on your face, making an effort to cross your hands and put them on your lap. Then when the urge comes to pick your hands up and touch your face, you'll be more aware of what you're doing and you'll be quicker to catch yourself. I cleaned my hands before I touched my face.
Some really important and useful instructions there from Mariko, from me, from the whole Newsday team. Thanks for watching.